Good evening, relatives. We're going to go ahead and wait a few moments and let folks arrive. We will be starting here shortly, so thank you for joining us this evening. And just real quickly, our panelists this evening will be Beata Tsosie-Peña, Ian Zabarte, and Leona Morgan. So give us a few more moments and we will go ahead and get started. All right. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so we have a lot to cover this evening. So I want to go ahead and kick us off right now. Good evening, relatives. Thank you all for tuning in this evening. And before we get started, I want us all to recognize that wherever you may be tuning in from on Turtle Island, that you are on native land. We predate so-called America. So just real quickly, I want to go over some housekeeping. This session is being recorded. There is a link that will be shared to our website. This session is also being streamed Facebook Live. Thank you for those who are watching on Facebook, and we will try to check in on comments and questions as we chug along here. All our attendees are on mute, and your video screens are not on display, so no worries. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function. Again, you can also submit questions on Facebook Live, and we will try to get to those. However, we have approximately 1 hour this evening, so we may not be able to respond to any of the questions, in which case we will put them in a parking lot and follow up with our panelists and provide those answers back to our audiences. If you are registered for this teach-in, then you are registered for the next upcoming teach-ins. Also, you may share this registration link, bit.ly Native Perspectives Uranium, to invite others to join. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself and our panelists, and then we will dive into our dialogue. She'eya Talia Boyd and Shia, Twitch Eatney and Shle, Toa Higlini Bushes Chin, Asche Edeshe Do, Tobahanda Janella, Het Audena Essa and Shle, Natna Georgia Asia Hawan. Good evening, relatives. My name is Talia Boyd. I am of the Bitterwater clan, born for Water Flows Together. My maternal grandfather is Red Bottom, and my paternal grandfather is Water's Edge. I currently reside in Gallup, New Mexico, and I am the Cultural Landscapes Program Manager for the Grand Canyon Trust. And now I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Tonight we have Miss Leona Morgan, who is Diné. She grew up on the Navajo Nation. She is a community organizer and activist who has been fighting nuclear colonialism since 2007. Leona co-founded and works for Diné No Nukes to address uranium mining as part of the entire nuclear fuel chain. Excuse me, and the Nuclear Issues Study Group, which works to protect New Mexico from all things nuclear. Leona collaborates with local, regional, and national groups to address nuclear waste issues in the US and is part of the international campaign Don't Nuke the Climate that focuses on nuclear energy as a global climate issue. Leona attended the University of New Mexico and lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Thank you for joining us this evening, Leona. Next, I would like to introduce Principal Man Ian Zabarte, who is a descendant of Chief Kawich, chief of all the Central Great Basin Western Shoshone. He has worked on nuclear issues to protect his people and land from radiation and fallout from more than 900 nuclear weapons tests conducted in secret within Shoshone country. Together with the Global Anti-Nuclear Alliance, the Shoshone pressured a test ban moratorium in the 1990s and began investigating impacts of radioactive fallout within the boundaries of the Treaty of Ruby Valley. Working collaboratively with tribal community and researchers, he created the Native Community Action Council, a party with standing in the Atomic Safety Licensing Board panel of the US Regulatory Commission. Licensing of the proposed Yucca Mountain repository with the only contentions of ownership of the proposed Yucca Mountain high-level nuclear waste repository. After $15 billion, 1 million times 15,000 spent on investigation at Yucca Mountain, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission agreed and made note that the Department of Energy has failed to meet the requirements. In 2018, he was appointed to the NRC Licensing Support Network, licensees for his experiencing on licensing domestic nuclear facilities. He is also a board member of the Puha Ba Traditional Native American Healing Center. Thank you for joining us this evening, Ian. Next, I would like to introduce Beata Tsosie-Peña. Beata is from the Santa Clara Pueblo in El Rito, New Mexico. She is a mother, a poet, a seed keeper, and is certified in infant massage as a developmental specialist and educator, a full spectrum doula and breastfeeding support counselor, and an Indigenous sustainable design permaculture. She's currently on the steering committee for the Native American Farmers Association and Flowering Tree Permacultural Institute Board of Directors. She's also serving on the New Mexico Governor's Task Force for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women as a Pueblo representative. The realities of living next to a nuclear weapons complex has called her into environmental health and justice work with the nonprofit organization Tewa Women United for over a decade. As part of her work with TWU, she is currently managing the creation of the Espanola Healing Foods Oasis Demonstration Garden Project and Espanola Healing Foods Seed Library. Thank you for joining us this evening, Beata. And just real quickly, before we get started in our dialogue, I would like to note that we are all tribal members speaking from our own perspectives and our experiences from working within our tribal communities and with other tribes. We are not speaking on behalf of our tribes or any tribes this evening. Thank you. I also want to give a brief description for our series this evening. So the exploitation of uranium and other natural resources for the production of nuclear energy and for the use by the US government continues to extensively impact and subjugate already marginalized communities and heavily contributes to issues of health disparities, boom and bust economies, and systemic dispossession of cultural resources and ancestral land. Threats from the nuclear fuel cycle remain throughout tribal communities from uranium mining and waste storage facilities. Nuclear waste storage is an immense burden and is a problem worldwide. There is no safe, permanent repository anywhere in the world for nuclear waste. Here in the United States, mostly poor and non-white communities carry the brunt of radioactive pollution from the nuclear fuel cycle. Almost all uranium mining worldwide is on or near indigenous communities. And most of those impacted communities are already overwhelmingly inundated by systematic barriers that do not allow them the capacities and resources to advocate for standards that demand transparency and accountability from federal and state governmental entities. No one wants radioactive pollution in their homes and their bodies. So this issue of uranium, again, is it's a huge issue. It's an emotional issue, and it hits home for a lot of tribal communities because, again, we have been inundated by these industries. So I want to go ahead and kick us off with our questions this evening. And these questions are open to all of our panelists, so feel free to jump in and answer. But I'll go ahead and direct this question and have Ian go ahead and start us off. How has your tribe been impacted by uranium or nuclear colonialism?
Thank you, Talia, for inviting me to be part of this series. And I just added a link to our webpage that you can click on and get some of the graphics. We're all downwinders, and our experience, the Shoshone experience, has been as victims of United States and United Kingdom testing of weapons of mass destruction, as you stated in my bio. We've suffered from the 900 tests taking place, over 900 tests taking place secretly in Shoshone country. It's a treaty violation for the United States to conduct these activities in secret. It's unconstitutional, it's un-American. Uranium is the core material used in the production of weapons of mass destruction. The enduring purpose of weapons of mass destruction is the production of, the enduring purpose of nuclear technology is the production of weapons of mass destruction. And uranium is the core material. It's mined, it's processed, it's fabricated into fuel, it's taken to nuclear power plants where the nuclear material is made, that is plutonium and enriched uranium. Those are what is going into the bombs. The bomb at the Trinity site, the bombs in the Shoshone country, and the bombs produced by other countries. And this is part of the military industrial complex that we'll talk about later. But we are all downwinders. The fallout has gone across the United States, across the oceans around the world. The material from weapons testing is in everything. If we had funding, if we had opportunity, we could do so much research to understand the adverse health consequences known to be plausible from exposure to radiation in the fallout. It took us a long time just to get the National Cancer Institute to produce a report on radioactive fallout in 1997, which was the National Cancer Institute's report on fallout from U.S. nuclear weapons testing. And those maps demonstrate that some of the highest fallout is in southern Idaho, southern the Dakotas, North Dakota, because the rain carried the radiation across the country. The wind carried the radiation across the country. It rained and fell on the grass. The cows ate the grass, and that milk was transported into the inner cities. So people can go to those websites and find information about their own exposure. We're all downwinders. In the Grand Canyon, for example, I was at the South Rim at the Visitor Center, and there's a graphic which shows the pollution coming from Southern California and Arizona and the clean air coming from Nevada. Also in that clean air was the fallout. So these weapons tests, 900 and 100 of those were in the atmosphere. Every one of those tests bent radiation. They call it a venting, a controlled venting. But if they didn't control it, it would be released. The other problem is it's done in secret. The culture of secrecy doesn't tell us when these releases took place. For example, the Mighty Oak event took place 3 weeks before Chernobyl. Its radiation went around the world, and if it wasn't for the accident in Chernobyl, the radiation monitors were ready for that radiation. They picked up the Mighty Oak event, and it was a cover-up by the Department of Energy. That's how the culture of secrecy treats us. And that fallout went everywhere. So we really could do more research. We need to follow individuals. We need to more funding for Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And we need to understand these things before any new sources of exposure take place, such as the proposed high-level nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain.
Thank you, Ian. Beata or Leona, would you like to add to that? Or actually, yes, how has your, and just to reiterate the question, how has your tribe or pueblo been impacted by uranium or nuclear colonialism? And before we go any deeper, I'd like to ask Leona, would you mind defining what nuclear colonialism is or what it means? Thank you.
Sure. So the definition I've been using is taken from writings by Winona LaDuke, Ward Churchill, and others. I'm just going to read what I have here and add a little bit to it. Basically what Ian's talking about is an example of nuclear colonialism. Nuclear colonialism is the systematic dispossession of indigenous lands, exploitation of cultural resources, and the subjugation and oppression of indigenous peoples to further nuclear production, either of energy or weapons proliferation. And this is from uranium mining, which happens mostly on indigenous lands worldwide, uranium processing, weapons testing, and waste storage. And this results in what we call a slow genocide of indigenous peoples, as well as destruction of indigenous cultures, current day relocation, and the creation of national sacrifice zones. So this is what, when we talk about nuclear colonialism, it's basically the ongoing colonization of our lands. So the theft of our lands through taking it for mining, and then also the contamination of our water, the taking of our resources, as well as the contamination to our DNA. And that will impact our future generations, but also the long-lived impacts of radioactive contamination to our sacred places and the integrity of our holy beings that live in these places, and the different medicines and the resources that we use to continue our ways of life.
Thank you so much for providing that definition, Leona. Would you mind speaking a little bit about how uranium or nuclear colonialism has impacted the Diné Nation and the work that you've done?
Sure. So uranium mining happens, like I said, the majority of times on indigenous lands worldwide. So I just want folks to know that the stories I hear and the examples of the impacts to our people are the same all over the world. You can just substitute out a different company, and then even mining, the extractive industry as well. You can just substitute different minerals and the ways our Mother Earth is raped, and the contamination and the health impacts. It's all very similar. Uranium mining in the United States was largely started for weapons. So exactly what Ian was talking about. And this is from the 50s to the early 70s. It was all for weapons. And the United States was the only purchaser of uranium, which resulted in the United States buying from private companies. So a lot of private companies came in, mined all over the place, and this happened before. A large part of it was before there was any laws in place for the protection of our environment. The National Environmental Policy Act was passed in Congress in 1969, and then the EPA didn't start till 1970. The Clean Drinking Water Act and other laws weren't passed until later. So a lot of the mining that happened was before there were laws in place to protect our environment. And this also includes protection for workers, downwinders, and all of that. So it left 15,000 abandoned mines across the entire country. These are uranium mines. There's over 600,000 mines that were abandoned across the country, just any kind of mining. But with uranium mining, about 15,000. And on Navajo Nation, they count 523 distinct sites. Most people say it's somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000, just on Navajo Nation. And of course, because of colonization, our homelands are actually much bigger than the current day reservation. But the impacts that we see today, after the boom of the 50s to the 70s, the mining then was a little bit more regulated. Of course, it had the same impacts. And then it was also used not just for weapons, but nuclear energy. And a large part of those mines, well, all of the mines pretty much, I would say, I can't give you an exact number, but I would say the majority, almost all of the mines have just been sitting there until, some enforcement of cleanup started. On Navajo, we do have a working, the nation has a working relationship with the federal government. So there's been 5 agencies trying to do the cleanup since 2008 in 5-year plans. So since 2008, they've cleaned up 3 sites. And if you can just do some really simple math at that rate, to clean up the other 520 would take over 2,000 years. And that's not even to mention the other, 14,500. So what we're seeing today are the health effects from long-term low-level exposure. And a lot of the studies that were done under the Southwest Research and Information Center, SRIC, with, in partnership with the University of New Mexico, there are a lot of known effects specifically to Diné people, including kidney disease, autoimmune disease, lots of health problems. And then with the most recent, within the last 10 years, the Navajo birth cohort study has shown that there's high levels of uranium in people's urine. So these are people living all over the res, not just at abandoned uranium mine sites. And this includes infants less than 1 year of age. So even though the mining mostly stopped in the 80s, there's no mining on Navajo Nation. We have a law against that now. We also have a law against the transport of radioactive materials, but we're still seeing it. Our people are still dying from cancers and other health problems. So there's a lot of effects. And just to wrap up, we can see how severely it's impacted not just our people, but other places that were mined for uranium, like our relatives in South Dakota and North Dakota is being hit really hard right now with COVID-19. And this has a lot to do with the implications from the uranium mining, as well as the lack of water, because a lot of it was contaminated. And so in our nation, about 20 to 30% of people still live with no running water in the house, which makes it very hard to, wash your hands for 20 seconds after you go outside and interact with people. I mean, if you are already lacking access to clean drinking water, and then now with the virus, it's having very severe impacts in Indian country, as we call it sometimes. So yeah, there's a lot more, but I'll just stop there for now. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. There is definitely a lot to cover. Thank you. Thank you, Leona. Beata, would you mind sharing what's happening in the Pueblos and how they're being impacted by nuclear colonialism?
Yeah, I think similar to what was already said, I think, the people of New Mexico were the first unknowing victims of the first atomic bombing. But also thinking about the production leading up to the Trinity test, where Los Alamos National Laboratories were completely unregulated. And so where we live in the production end of the nuclear complex. And so again, it is a lot of that, thinking about those intergenerational harms and impacts that do affect ongoing generations and their health. So those years when the labs were completely unregulated, all of the waste, all of the chemicals, astronomical amounts of airborne plutonium being released into the skies. And this was, my grandparents' generation that had to endure a lot of those direct impacts of what they were breathing in. These are still a lot of what we're dealing with that we call legacy waste contamination from these unregulated years. So that's hundreds of contaminated sites located on our ancestral homelands in the Pajarito Plateau, which is part of the larger Jemez mountain range, and the Valles Caldera, which are, really our sacred mountain range. So it's also dealing with the continued militarization of native lands in a way that is just through, well, it came about through the War Powers Act, eminent domain, with that shroud of secrecy, like Ian mentioned. And so our people didn't really know what was happening at first, just knowing that the military was going up there. So they are on top of our mountains, which, if you know, here in northern New Mexico, that's our watershed. Those are the beginnings of our watersheds. We're also downwind from anything released into the airs, any kind of stormwater runoff that comes off of the town or the laboratories makes its way into our aquifer, into our ephemeral streams and arroyos, makes its way into our river systems. So the whole state has been really impacted through this production. And as far as like the Pueblos, I think we're set up for increased harm just with our land-based existence. There's been a lot of advocacy from tribal communities to get our way of life recognized in environmental protections, as far as being land-based peoples, still living off the land, still harvesting wild plants and animals, being an agricultural community outdoors for longer periods of time. And the nonprofit I work with, Table Women United, we've been advocating for years around Navat'oi Gia, which is indigenous, which is land worker mother, being the standard of protection for environmental exposures and cleanup and worker standards. Because right now there's a lot of environmental racism around those national standards of protection being based off of an adult white male still to this day. So these really obsolete standards of reference for determining environmental and worker exposure that have not been updated since the beginning of the nuclear colonial age. There's also been a lot of issues that I feel as far as losing access to our cultural sites that are now occupied by Los Alamos. A lot of our traditional sites are now behind armed guards and razor wire. It's been a lot of kind of ongoing harm in just trying to practice our traditional ways of knowing and relating to these places. There's a nuclear waste dump up there that we know is just a ticking time bomb as far as with what's underground and above ground, over 30,000 barrels of mixed radioactive waste above and below ground in unlined dirt pits, hundreds of contaminated sites that very little remediation and cleanup actually happening, more of a focus on monitoring and testing, but not very much cleanup at all. The cleanup of these sites is determined by approved budget from the laboratories and the DOE. So it's not the necessity of our community health driving cleanup, it's their budget that drives cleanup. And again, those cleanup standards aren't protective of those most vulnerable in our communities. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of impacts as land-based peoples that we also share with neighboring communities. You know, it's Pueblos, it's Acequia communities, land grant communities here in northern New Mexico, that we all share a lot of concerns around these ongoing impacts. And then it's also concerns around our reproductive health. You know, as was mentioned, that ability of us to raise our families in a healthy, clean, safe environment. These are some of the only toxins that can cross placental boundaries. And so that's impacting whatever this pregnant family is exposed to. In one pregnancy, that's impacting 3 generations right off the bat, because our children are born with their reproductive capacity, you know, at birth. And so whatever contaminants are crossing into our bodies, whether through land-based exposures or whether through direct exposures of inhalation or food systems, you know, we are feeling those impacts. And there's no health studies, or because of the environmental racism, we're still having to have validation from Western scientific community to back us up on the harm that we see happening on a daily basis. And so my lived experience has been a lot of miscarriages, a lot of things like that, a lot of cancers. I lost all of my elders to cancer in the community, and different forms, because as radioactive isotopes break down, it impacts different parts of the body as it starts to decompose. So that generation that inhaled that airborne plutonium leading up to the Trinity test, there was a lot of lung cancer in the community. As that breaks down more, then maybe it affects the bone. So then there's a generation that has bone cancer, maybe a generation that has stomach cancer based on what they ate. I have a great aunt right now in our Pueblo who has skin cancer on the bottoms of her foot. How do you get skin cancer on the bottom of your foot? Well, it's because she's a potter and she mixes the clay. She's mixed clay with her feet her whole life. And to get to the clay, you have to dig through the upper layer of soil to those soils that were then exposed during this time of contamination, you know, and again, this is all things that we say, but we don't have any studies to back up what we're saying. So it's really hard to get reparations and center our people's health and wellness when it comes to being in a sacrifice zone for the country's security and energy needs, you know, which is not just when we're not at the table, we don't have representation. We have to fight for just basic public processes and to be fully informed of what's happening in our backyard. So I could go on also, but I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you so much, Beata. You hit on a lot of really great points. All of you did, and thank you all for adding to that. You're right, you know, cleanup, who pays for it? Taxpayers for the most part, right? We're the ones who are flipping the bill for this cleanup that they constantly push back over and over again. And yes, we don't have any studies in our communities. We need water studies, we need air studies, soil studies, health studies. These are studies that we are still pleading for in our communities. And there's other communities that have been impacted as well. White communities, you know, 3 Mile Island, they had a ton of resources pouring in immediately and national media coverage, whereas our communities are still trying to get the word out and share this information. And people are really kind of clueless when it comes to how these impacts are hitting Indian country. So thank you all for highlighting how our communities are being impacted. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question here. And this is kind of a big one. And I know Ian, I'll have Ian kick us off again. What is the military industrial complex?
Okay, I think the best way to answer that is to kind of contrast what's important to indigenous people. Our identity is the land. Our identity is pure, pristine water. Our identity is the oldest life on the planet here in the Great Basin, which is the bristlecone pine, which is 6,800 years, which is the Pando, which is 24 square miles and up to 80,000 years, and the flowing water that's been flowing for millions of years. This is what's important to us. The military industrial complex, having bombs, making weapons of mass destruction at any cost is what's important. Okay, and for that, it was coined by President Dwight D. Eisenhower after World War II, and he warned about this out of control weapons buildup. And in case you aren't aware, the United States brought Nazis. They brought 1,600 Nazis, some of them Nazi party leaders from Germany during and after the war. And these are the people that designed and built the infrastructure for the US nuclear weapons programs in those labs in Los Alamos. And they even came out here to Shoshone country to watch their weapons of mass destruction be exploded. And they went as far as to create this, what we might call the Plutonium Economy, to build tens of thousands of these weapons of mass destruction between the United States and Russia. 56,000 weapons. Imagine B-52 bombers on the United States part and the Russian Bear bombers flying 24 hours a day, taking CO2 up to 50,000 feet and doing that 24 hours a day for 40 years. That's what we're doing, burning up our environment, mining, destroying people and killing them, preparing to kill them. And it's still going on today. We have these weapons of mass destruction that were built by this military industrial complex, high-paying jobs for electricians and pipe fitters and these trades, construction, to build these facilities, weapons we will never use. That's what we're doing, and that's the military industrial complex to me. And I just want to give everyone else opportunity to talk on these issues, and we have a lot more to go, but that's what the military industrial complex is to me. And they're here in Shoshone country as trespassers. There's no claim under the treaty. And when these workers are injured, there are 106 illnesses issued by the International Labor Organization. And in the United States, 10,700 people were compensated for their cancers based on the probability of causation from a research at the National Institutes of Health. And that is available online. And it's important to look at some of those things, but that's the military industrial complex. And that's the part that is not spoken about. That's the culture of secrecy.
Beata, Leona, would any of you like to add to that?
I would add that, how I got into this work was the realization of experiencing high explosive detonations rumbling through our landscape on an almost daily basis when I first got into this work, before I really knew what those explosions our communities were experiencing were. And it was this realization of just like the years of silence growing up, how we're not taught about these activities happening in our lands. And that, wow, it's war. If it was that traumatic for me just to hear that and feel those vibrations in our sacred lands, imagine being on the receiving end of these weapons globally. And at the labs, it's not just nuclear weapons that they're maintaining and producing, and while they're maintaining the pits of the existing nuclear weapon stockpile, they're constantly researching smaller, more usable weapons and bullets that are being used in warfare today. And it's also chemical and biological weapons that they're researching up there. So yeah, it's really abhorrent, what's taking place up there and what we're kind of forced to endure, which goes against all of our values and belief systems as Pueblo peoples and our roles as caregiving these places. And yeah, it's supporting this militarized war-based economy that cannot sustain itself unless we're in a constant state of war. And that's what we've been in. And that's what I've experienced my whole life, is this constant state of warfare, so that that war-based militarized economy can continue. And I never thought we would have aid entities like Halliburton and Bechtel on the Pajarito Plateau. You know, that's just like, wow, these people are here in our backyard, on our sacred ancestral sites. And it's a huge issue, this culture of violence, you know, that has attempted to separate peoples from their land. It hasn't succeeded as of yet completely, but it's really trying, you know, and it can't do that with Indigenous peoples because we are this land.
Leona, would you like to add anything?
I think both Beata living where Lanel was built and the violence that continues today with the expansions, I think she said it all, and Ian and his people being the most bombed nation on the planet. I mean, my family, I don't live in a contaminated place. I grew up in I'm very privileged to say that I didn't live in a contaminated place, and we have, you know, running water in my house. I'm actually in my parents' house where I grew up, and we have electricity, Wi-Fi, and so I'm very privileged to do this work. But I am doing it on behalf of my family and relatives who live in places that were very much contaminated and had. The way I got involved was because a lot of my relatives were coming down with cancers and different health problems, and we didn't know why. And this was growing up. I grew up and lived, you know, close to these places, and I went to school in Gallup, New Mexico, just less than 20 miles from the world's largest uranium spill, and they don't teach this stuff in school. Part of the secrecy and mass numbing of nuclearism, but as soon as I learned about these things, it was because of the so-called nuclear renaissance that the industry was pushing in 2006 and 2007, when the price of uranium went really high. This is when I found out about uranium mining. I heard about it, I knew a little bit, but I didn't realize how close to home it hit. And so now today, we're dealing with a lot of new threats, ongoing pushes for uranium mining as a so-called critical mineral, or like Beata was saying, energy independence. But I think the biggest thing I'm concerned about with all of the issues that we're talking about is that people don't know, and that it's continuing. And now this push for modernization of nuclear weapons, as well as the false, the lies that nuclear is clean energy. I mean, it's ridiculous to say this. So we're dealing with a whole new monster right now with climate change and the Green New Deal and others, even Biden, you know, considering Biden saying that, you know, we have to consider all low carbon and no carbon forms of energy. This is a direct assault on our people. And it's that continuation of what we're talking about, nuclear colonialism. So yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you all. Those were excellent answers. Let's go ahead and jump into our next question. How does the 1872 mining law play into uranium issues? And this is a big one. And anybody who works on, you know, mining issues knows that the 1872 mining law is in dire need of being just completely taken out. So let's go ahead and have Ian. I guess we got a little circle, a little rotation going here. Ian, would you mind speaking on that, please?
Yeah, the 1872 Mining Act authorizes abuse of Native Americans. It's similar to the Interceptor Bull of 1452 and the Interceptor Bull of 1493 that authorizes Christian conquest of North Africa and North America. These are authorizations, and the Mining Act gives authority to mine. And the laws in the United States are emanate from Christianity. And the United States Supreme Court in the Marshall Trilogy, Chief Justice John Marshall set up the, in 1823, I believe, 1808 and 1813 and 1823, set up the cases for the plenary power of Congress, and later the 1872 Mining Act. But the basis for relations between the Shoshone and the United States are the 6 Shoshone Treaties. And those are from 1863, not the Bible, not Christianity, and that's not our living life way. So we're trying to protect our land from trespassing. So it's important to note that 70% of US gold production comes from Shoshone country. And the United States gave away Shoshone property before there was a United States here. So we need to address the 1872 Mining Act or trespassers within Shoshone country that don't make claims under the treaty. And it's been going on for a long time. And the abuse started even earlier than that. In the 1700s, the Spanish came into our country, and after the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Article 11, both sides agreed not to make Indians homeless so that we wouldn't be a burden on Mexico, and we would stay in our own homelands. In 1850, the state of California then passed the Act for the Protection and Governance of the Indians, and it authorized professional Indian hunters to make things safe for the miners that were coming, the 49ers, 1849, and people were making more money killing Indians, killing my people, and enslaving us to build those missions in California. That was the Spanish, and the people in California are oblivious to the genocide that was authorized by law in California. And Wells Fargo provided the transport of the gold that was paying for all of that killing. We're lucky to have survived. We're here and we're not going anywhere. And the propaganda that came along, people were killing Indians based on fear, and they still did it. They tortured our people to find that gold. That's what mining does. I think it's beyond the 1872 Mining Act, but the 1872 Mining Act authorizes abuse. And that's what we need to curb. We need to curb abuse, and there's ways to do that.
Ladies, would you like to add to that?
I can jump in here. The mining law was a tool of colonization, just like the railroads. In the preamble or the preface of the actual mining law, it cites manifest destiny. I mean, it was literally a tool that was used to legitimize, just like the doctrine of discovery. You know, it's a piece of paper written in a foreign language that was used to legitimize the theft and killing of the theft of our lands and the killing of our people. And today, I know there's a lot of people that want to work toward reforming this law, because for those of you who don't know what it is, the 1872 mining law basically gives access to mine certain hard rock minerals, including gold, silver, copper, molybdenum, uranium, vanadium, on US public lands. And back then, they were still trying to establish the United States and expand it. But what it did was give private ownership to individuals who could prove that they could mine these minerals for a profit. And then they didn't even have to pay royalties. They just paid a flat fee to the United States government, which is less than $10 today. And it's the law is intact. So the same thing applies today. They don't have to pay for royalties mining these things. And it affects Indigenous people a lot. I mean, look at Oak Flat, Mount Taylor. These are sacred places, the Grand Canyon, the Black Hills. And I would say that any NGO who's working toward reforming this law must include reparations as well as land back. It's not just about the mining and the contamination. It's giving the land back to the rightful owners. And so this is something I think folks who are in the realm of working in Congress to do this kind of work need to include Indigenous peoples and nations at the decision-making table while they're doing this work. It's imperative that we are a part of these discussions and negotiations, and not tokenized to parade us around in Congress, but to actually do meaningful and fair discussions with Indigenous peoples in order to hear what we actually want with these lands that were taken from us under the guise of 1872 mining law. Thanks.
I don't have anything to add, Talia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ian and Leona. So let's go ahead and move on to our next question. This is, what kind of efforts are being made to address uranium or nuclear issues in or near your homelands?
So I guess I'll take that up. Very little is being done by the United States. What has been done is, as you mentioned in the introduction, we created the Native Community Action Council. We began in 1992 to investigate the adverse health consequences known to be plausible from exposure to radiation and fallout that we were experiencing. So we looked at our plants and our animals, and at the same time, we were being attacked by the United States, challenging us for our own property. And I need to clarify, property is not a thing. It's a relationship between people with regard to things. So the treaty is that relationship. And again, I have to say that that is the law. That is the supreme law of the land under Article 2, Section 6 of the U.S. Constitution, the Treaty Supremacy Clause. All state laws conflicting are invalid. So our horses were contemplated, our livestock was contemplated in the treaty, Article 7, as hunters or herdsmen. Our transition to change of the Americans, or the immigrants coming to our country, were horses and livestock. And in 1971, the United States Congress defined our Indian ponies that we've had for hundreds of years, that we've raised on our land, defined our Indian ponies, our horses, as wild. There's no such thing as a wild horse. They don't exist. They're dying in the wild. That's why they have to be taken off the range. They're unmanaged, but this is what the United States Congress did. Then they went after our ranchers. They blamed us for destruction of the range caused by their weapons testing. The fallout from the weapons destroyed the delicate flora and fauna in our country. And the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, blamed the Shoshone ranchers for the destruction of our lands caused by the US government in secret. That's what happened in our country, and that's a shame. We began investigating our plants and animals because we were seeing problems in our livestock, in our people, and we took action, and we reviewed the Department of Energy's off-site radiation exposure review profile and determined that it was inappropriate for people living a subsistence lifestyle, people living closer to the ground. We looked at diet, mobility, and shelter, what we ate, how much we ate, how we prepared our food. We ate the whole animal. We used the whole animal. So the thyroid that absorbed radiation, we ate all of that and we got exposed. And we studied the radioactive iodine 131. Mobility, where we went and what we did there. Gathering wood. We see a hill of dead wood. That's great because the live pinyon is our staple food. So we would chop down that dead wood, burn it in our houses, burn it in our sweat, and we would get a new exposure to radiation from the smoke. So it's important to know what these exposure pathways are. And then shelter, where our houses were, what they were made from, and they were substandard. And we were never warned about the fallout. We didn't even have duct tape to tape the windows. That would have helped a lot if we would have just had tape the cracks up. We didn't have that, and we didn't know. My aunts and uncles, my grandparents, everybody, cousins were playing in the fallout, and they didn't know. I was luckily in San Francisco. I was born in San Francisco, but when I came home, everybody I had known all my life growing up, every summer we were on the reservation with dirt floors, You know, it's great that I'm not exposed, but everybody that I knew growing up was dying and having cancer, and I had to do something about this. And so I've spent the last 35 years working on nuclear issues. That's important to me, and that's what has to be done. And that's what uh, we've done to address these issues. We also used our experience as the basis for contentions in 2008 in the Atomic Safety Licensing Board licensing of Yucca Mountain. After spending $15 billion, that's $1 million times 15,000, the Department of Energy could not prove ownership to Shoshone property at Yucca Mountain, even with the Bureau of Land Management's master title plats, which are the land status record of the United States. The Department of Energy could not prove ownership to Shoshone property at Yucca Mountain. So that's what we've been doing, and we're ready to do more. We have to do more. We need refunding for the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. We need to identify individuals and follow individuals, because it's too difficult to prove causation because our population numbers are so small. That's how many people have been dying. We need help, we need support, we need funding, and we have ways that we can work these issues. And we need the United States to do the right thing. We need the United States citizens to step up, support us, and to help us, because we're all downwinders, and you're dying from it, you don't even know.
Thank you, Ian. Powerful. Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of times people don't realize how we are all very much impacted by nuclear issues. It's a ripple effect. You know, there's a lot of transportation routes that go across the country that we don't know about. It's all secret. The government doesn't want us to know about it, you know, so a lot of these things are swept under the rug, and it takes a lot of courage to even step up and talk about these things. So thank you for sharing that. Leona or Beata, would you like to respond? And again, I'll ask the question one more time. What kind of efforts are being made to address uranium or nuclear issues in or near your homelands?
I'll go ahead real quick. For us as a nonprofit, you know, we work in collaboration with a lot of local NGOs and organizations. So we do a lot of networking, coalition work, combining our shared expertise and collective strengths to really advocate for the impacts that we're dealing with. We really prioritize community education and pushing back on this kind of historical shaming that has taken place amongst our people, where it's like, yes, we are very qualified and we are community experts to weigh in on these issues and give our voice, and really trying to lift that up as much as possible, including with our young people. We're doing active land restoration projects. So we're looking right now at very interested in bio and micro remediation as a form of using natural systems to help clean up contaminated sites. But again, that can only go so far if the harm is constantly happening. So while it's very successful, and there is the possibility of cleaning up these sites to 0 parts per billion contamination, it has to come with the simultaneous work of abolition and decommissioning of these sites nationwide and globally, so that the harm stops. And you know, I think we do also focus a lot on our traditional strengths and our ancestral strengths, and making sure that those knowledges are continuing to be passed on, that having the healthiest bodies possible through consuming our traditional foods and participating in our land-based existence is going to be probably our best defense to a lot of the environmental violence and threats that we face. But then it can also set us up for increased exposure if we're not careful and active in you know, finding out what it is we're dealing with and what we're facing as impacted communities. So a lot of work happening on our end, just with like community education and advocacy.
And I have a few slides I want to show to illustrate what we're talking about. And I also have a quote I want to read. So
Sure.
I mentioned 15,000 abandoned uranium mines, and I just want to acknowledge all the people who have done work on all of these issues, all of our elders and ancestors, and those who have passed on. and the ones that will take it on in the future. I want to acknowledge them too. This quote comes from a good friend of mine named Harold. I'm spacing out on his last name. I'm so sorry, Harold. Harold says, the Honkpapa survived genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, drinking bad water contaminated with uranium, and bad IRA, tribalism, bureaucracy, and it failed to protect the Honkpapa. We fought alone for so long, finally, until Charmaine Whiteface helped us reclaim the toxic abandoned uranium mining in the Grand River Valley. So this is specifically regarding some of our relatives up north, and Charmaine Whiteface led an effort called Clean Up the Mines. Clean Up the Mines was focused on getting a law in Congress to do just that, to clean up all the 15,000 abandoned uranium mines across the country. And that's not just to protect our people, that's to protect everyone. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures real quick. Right now, Navajo, like I said, we have a law that says no more uranium mining, but there's people now working on cleanup, and it's very much kind of a piecemeal kind of thing, because it's incredibly expensive to clean up these sites, and Congress would rather invest in new bombs and new weapons than cleaning up the mess they already made. So again, these issues don't just affect us, it's worldwide where these things happen. So this is just an image of all the places in the world that have uranium, where uranium's been produced. Australia, Canada, and Kazakhstan are the world's largest producers of uranium. Energy Fuels, which is of concern because of the uranium mining at the Grand Canyon, is a Canadian company. Several of the, Chemico and all of those are big offenders. So here's a map of the abandoned uranium mines in the US. There's a few in the east, but they're mostly in the west. And you can see they're largely focused around the four corners. And our nation, Navajo Nation, is here. Ian's folks are out here. Beata's folks are there. But if you look at the deposits just on a US map, I'm going to show, here's Alaska. Can't forget about Alaska as well. I want to go into this issue of what do we do with the waste from the nuclear power plants. So this is related because right now we're dealing with a lot more destruction from the nuclear industry, from both the development of nuclear weapons as well as nuclear energy. And so all of these nuclear reactors across the country, they're beginning to shut down. And the communities where these reactors are, they want the waste to be moved out of their community because, it's dangerous. Why would anyone want to keep it? So the idea is to move it to New Mexico. So there's two proposals, one in New Mexico and one on the state line of New Mexico and Texas, to move the waste from all of the power plants in the country to the Southwest. Now, just look at this next map. I overlapped the uranium mining map with the nuclear power plants map and the waste map. Notice there's no nuclear reactors in the areas where uranium was mined and where they want to put the waste. But this is where we live. And so they want to, bring the waste to our communities. First, it wasn't enough that they contaminated our land with uranium mining and taking our land to build bombs and test bombs, but now they're trying to stick us with the waste. I forgot to point out Yucca Mountain, which is also in Ian's area. So yeah, so there is some work to clean up. There are some people who have fought very hard. Again, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the folks that we've lost recently. Deborah White Plume, she just passed away, and she was a very strong advocate against uranium mining, as well as my personal mentor, Robert Tohe, and many, many others. These are just people I know who have passed away this year, who have fought this issue and have both died from cancers. And so this is what we're dealing with, is the ongoing health effects and the trauma to our people and to our Mother Earth.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. Thank you all so much for your insight and your knowledge and your wisdom. It's a lot to absorb and think about. So we have about a minute left, and I would really encourage everybody who tuned in tonight to take this information and share it with your relatives, your family, your friends. We need to talk about these things. These are very important issues. And I always say this is life work. And for everybody here on this panel, we know that because we have been doing this work for quite a while. So very, very appreciative to all the panelists this evening for your hard work, your sacrifice, your dedication, and your deep commitment to justice and the fight, the good fight for your peoples. So thank you all for joining me this evening. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Join us again next Thursday. December 3rd. We will not be having a teach-in next Thursday. And I just want to end with a quote real quickly. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. This is Chief Seattle, and it's a pretty well-known quote, but this is indigenous thought, and this is how we like to share information. So thank you all again for joining us. And thank you panelists. Everybody take good care of yourselves. And again, please tune in on December 3rd for our next teach-in. Thank you all so much. Ihyahet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, and just real quickly, we will save those questions and put them in our parking lot. And we got some really great questions from our audiences. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And we will follow up with those. Have a good evening, everybody.